Good day and welcome to lesson 4 in our study of the book of Daniel. Today we're in chapter 2, the first 13 verses. Chapter 2 is divided really in 3 parts. The first part has to do primarily with Nebuchadnezzar, the second part primarily with Daniel, and the third part with both Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar together. And as we go through this, we must continue to think of the 2 main themes of the book of Daniel. One is God's sovereignty, and the second is man's need for obedience. And Nebuchadnezzar, it says in the start of this chapter, in the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Now there's a little difficulty here because when Nebuchadnezzar invaded Judah, he was called back to Babylon because of the death of his father, and therefore he became king. But now, and then when Daniel was taken to Babylon along with the other captives, it says he and those other captives underwent a 3-year apprenticeship program to be indoctrinated into the culture of Babylon. But now we're in the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. This may be explained by the fact that sometime the first year of a king's reign in those days was not considered to be the first year of his reign, but the year of his ascension, and therefore the next year was actually the first year of his reign. Our controversy, maybe Daniel was not finished his apprenticeship when all this story took place. But anyways, and it says in the 2nd year of his reign, he had a bad dream. Even though he was the most powerful man on earth at the time, controlling all essentially the known world, he still could not avoid his dreams. And he had a bad dream. He had a bad dream similar to that of Job's friend back in the book of Job, where he had a bad dream and was frightened and terrified because of this apparition that he had seen and because of the information which the dream had portrayed to him. And Nebuchadnezzar was the same. He had this dream, he had this nightmare. And he was so troubled that he couldn't sleep. And he called all his wise men, all his magicians, his astrologers, his sorcerers, Chaldeans, to help interpret this dream. Now this would not be unusual in those days because most of the people around the king's court were people who were supposed to be people of knowledge, of astrology, able to foretell the future. And it seems that the king was not really onto this as much as it might seem from the beginning, because he said, when the Chaldeans spoke to the king, they said, "Tell us your dream, and we will give you the interpretation." Many dreams have many interpretations, and it's the same as the astrological signs. If you read your horoscope in the paper, you can take almost anything you want from that if you want to apply it to your own life. This is what makes it so unreliable, makes themselves so foolish. So, the Chaldeans were saying the same thing, "Tell us your dream, and we will give you the interpretation." So the king was a little more smart than that. He said, back in verse 5, "You make known my dream to me. You tell me what my dream was, and then give me the interpretation." You see, he wasn't really convinced that all these people were actually what they said to be. He was not convinced that all the things that they said that they could do, they really could do. And he said, if you don't do this, if you don't give me this interpretation, don't give me what the dream said, then I will have you executed in all sorts of grisly ways. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was the ruler of the known world at that time. He was an absolute ruler. He was considered to be probably a god by many of his people. But at the same time, he was very, very cruel, very vindictive, very bloodthirsty. And anything he said went, regardless of how extreme it seemed to be. He answered to no one, so he thought, except himself. And as a result of this, he said that you tell me what my dream is, and tell me then the interpretation, and if you don't, I will have you executed in many and gory ways. And I said, If you tell me the dream and its interpretation, you will receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. But if you don't, I'll execute you. Therefore tell me the dream and what it means. Now he could do this. He had, as I said before, he had absolute authority, he had absolute control, and he had no real known enemies at the time. He had conquered the known world, and he could do what he wanted to do. In fact, it was he who developed the so-called hanging gardens of Babylon as a gift for his wife. That's one of the 7 wonders of the world at the time, to put flowers and gardens and greenery into what was really an arid land. So he could do all of these things, and he had no qualms about doing it either. History records him as being a very cruel and a very vindictive man. So his servants answered and said, tell us your dream, and we will give you the interpretation. And he says, down in verse 8, I know for certain that you would gain time, because you see that my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me. Now the time has changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. The point is being that the king, Nebuchadnezzar, was not a stupid man. And he did not believe all the things that the astrologers, the magicians, the Chaldeans were telling him. And he said, if you can really tell the future, if you can really know what the gods are saying, then tell me what the God sent me in the dream, and then give me the interpretation. If not, I will think that you were lying and cheating, and not up to what you said you were, and I will have you executed. So the Chaldeans, who were soothsayers and magicians, answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such things of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. If it is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. There's an implication here, because none of the gods of the ancient people ever came to earth in a way that they could speak to man. The only one that did was the true God that came to earth as Jesus Christ. And he came and spoke to man and interpreted for him and gave man the meaning that was behind his whole existence. But at this time, the magicians were saying there was no God who came to earth in flesh, whose dwelling is not with flesh. And for this reason, the king was angry and very furious and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them, because they were also now part of the king's entourage and the king's court. This first part is on the surface, very simple. The king had a dream. He asked for all his wise men to interpret the dream, and they could not. He also asked them to tell him what the dream was, and they obviously could not. And therefore, in his anger and in his authority and his vindictiveness, he wanted all his advisors, all his wise men, all his astrologers, all the men who counseled him put to death, including the ones who came from Judah, Daniel and his companions. Now the point of this is to set the stage for what Daniel will do next. And we will see again how God himself is supreme. He is sovereign. And Daniel, by believing in God and by following what God did for him and by praying, he was able to access that sovereignty and explain what was required. This is not a new story for many people. The story about Daniel and the dreams and the colossus that he dreamt about and what Nebuchadnezzar dreamt about is not a new story, but it's important to understand the background. How severe how vindictive, how cruel Nebuchadnezzar could be, and how much at his mercy were all his advisors, all his so-called courtiers, including now Daniel and his friends. So this sets the background for this story. Daniel, who has been there for at least 2 to 3 years, learning the customs of Babylon, learning the language of Babylon, now he is in great danger because of the king's anger and the king's fury at his own advisors for not telling him the true nature of his story. One of the interesting parts of this is, in the original, this part of the Bible and the next few chapters were written in Aramaic and not in Hebrew, because this was a language around which the Chaldeans and the Babylonians spoke, and which Daniel now spoke as being a member of the court of Babylon. So this whole story just settles down because of the king's dream and because of the fact that his own personal interpreters could not explain the dream and the interpretation to Nebuchadnezzar. The order was out to kill everyone, including Daniel and his friends, even though they were not involved at the meeting with Nebuchadnezzar, but they were all part of his advisors, and the king wanted them, all the wise men of Babylon, executed. So this is the end of this part of the story, and we'll get on to the next part with Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar next week. This is rather a short version and a short story, but it sets the background for what's coming next. So thanks for watching, and hope to see you next week with part 2 of the second chapter of Daniel. Bye for now.